Members, it's the appointed time and we have a quorum. Let's get started with the meeting of the panel on constitutional affairs. Item 1 on the agenda, information papers issued since the last meeting. We have 2 papers. First, a joint letter issued by 22 members on the 4th of February requesting a special or joint meeting on the outbreak. Last Tuesday, the Health Services Panel held a special meeting to discuss outbreak control measures, and earlier there was an urgent question at a council sitting to deal with questions directed at government officials. So the letter has been dealt with in earlier panel or council sittings, and this letter was addressed to different panels. So barring any objections, we would not convene a special meeting at the CAP on this. The second paper was a letter sent by Dr. Priscilla LEUNG on the 28th of February requesting an explanation on the role of the Equal Opportunities Commission in May. The chairman of the EOC would attend a panel meeting for to deliver a regular briefing. The government has received this letter by Dr. Leung, and a response will be provided in due course. So should Dr. Leung wishes to follow up on the response, she can follow up at the meeting in May. Item number 2 on the agenda, items to be discussed at the next meeting. Please refer to the list of outstanding items for discussion and list of follow-up actions. The next regular meeting will be held on the 20th of April at 2:30 p.m. The government proposes the following discussion items. 1. Administrative guidelines on promotion of racial equality. And 2. Work report of the Office of the PCPD. These are the proposed discussion items for our meeting in April. Item 3. Electoral Affairs Commission report on the 2019 District Council ordinary election. Agenda item number 3 is the EAC report on the 2019 DC ordinary election, and item number 4 would be the proposed guidelines on election-related activities in respect of the electoral election. I believe when we discuss the report, we will be discussing the electoral election inevitably, and the attending officials for both items are very similar. So barring any objections from members, I suggest that the administration would brief us on both items, and then we can open up for a discussion on either the report or the proposed guidelines. Since you would be touching upon issues related to the electoral election, if you wish to have a separate discussion, I have no issues with that as well. If we combine both items, would the speaking time for the members increase as well? Yes. So it is up to the members. I have no preference. Mrs. Regina Yip, would there be any confusion if we discuss the district council election and electoral election at the same time? If there are objections from members, then we would have separate discussion of both items. All right, item number 3, EAC report on the 2019 DC ordinary election. With us today, we have Mr. Andy Chan, Undersecretary for Constitutional and Mainland Affairs, Ms. Rosanna Law, Deputy Secretary, Ms. Cherry Young, Principal Assistant Secretary, Mr. Alan Leung, Chief Electoral Officer of the REO, Mr. Raymond Wang, Principal Electoral Officer, and Ms. Jenny Chan, Deputy Chief Electoral Officer. Welcome. So I will first invite the Undersecretary to walk us through the paper. A slideshow would also be delivered. Thank you very much. Like the chairman said, we would outline the EAC report on the 2019 DC ordinary election. We would like to solicit members' views on some of the recommendations and observations. I would first invite Mr. Alan Leung, the Chief Electoral Officer, to brief all of you. Chairman, members, the 2019 District Council ordinary election was held on 24th of November last year. Under the Electoral Affairs Commission Ordinance, on the 24th of a report was submitted to the CE, and the government agreed to publication of the report. The report was published last Tuesday, and the report can be downloaded from the website of the EOC, www.eac.hk, and is available for viewing at the REO and Home Affairs Inquiry Centers of District Offices. The EAC outlines how the EAC supervises and oversees the election, and the report also reflected the experience learned from the election and proposed recommendations for future elections. New records were written in the 2019 DC general election. The number of elected seats increased from 431 to 455, while the number of polling stations increased to 615, and it was the first time all the seats were contested, and the number of electors multiplied from 1.47 to 2.9 million. The past district council election faced unprecedented challenges and was conducted under very challenging circumstances. The EAC also faced great challenges in its work. More than 20,000 civil servants took up different roles in the election. The recruitment work started last April, but we were unable to receive enough applications. And with the social developments and worsening of social order, many civil servants had concerns about taking part in the work out of worries over their personal safety and having to deal with conflicts. And as such, many applicants withdrew their applications. And eventually, with the help of various bureaus and departments, enough manpower was secured. Chapter 13 of the report summarized the challenges and specific incidents during the election and made recommendations on room for improvement and good practice. I would walk you through the main recommendations. First of all, queuing arrangements at polling stations. As with past district council elections, voting was open for 15 hours. In the past elections, there were no issues with queuing, and the presiding officers could exercise flexibility. But over this past election, in the first 3 hours, about 720,000 electors turned up, which was a record and 3 times the voter turnout of the previous election. And as such, there were long queues of people at many polling stations. And having considered the order at the polling stations and electors with different needs, the presiding officers were instructed to arrange the collection of ballot papers at the issuing desk based on the physical conditions of electors. For example, electors who could not stand for extended periods were arranged to sit down and wait inside the polling stations. And when it is their turn, they would collect their ballot papers. On polling day and in the aftermath of the election, there were calls from the community that people with special needs, such as pregnant women, physically handicapped persons with mobility difficulties, and senior citizens, should be allowed priority. In the coming electoral general election, we might consider allowing people with special needs or who could not stand for long periods to enjoy priority. The EAC will conduct public consultation on this issue to take in public views on the queuing arrangements. The EAC hopes to solicit the views of the public and give due consideration before deciding on the future queuing arrangements. And the second issue is the procedures of issuing ballot papers to electors. According to the EAC Electoral Procedure DC Regulation Section 53, upon arrival at the polling station, an elector should produce to the polling staff at the issuing desk the original of his or her HK identity card or other alternative documents before a ballot paper can be issued. And Section 56 also stipulates that before issuing a ballot paper to an elector, the PRO or polling staff should place a line across the name and identity document number of the elector in the copy of the final register to denote that a paper has been issued to that elector. In order to alleviate the concerns of electors, the EAC should explore reviewing the ballot paper issuing procedures, including how the identity of the electors can be cross-checked and how the electors can see that their names have been crossed out in the register, and care must be taken to ensure that the elector concerned cannot see other electors' particulars. And in terms of order in counting stations, in the past election, some people were unhappy with the counting procedures and results, or the results delivered by the PRO. They yelled and heckled the staff at the site and hampered the counting process. The EAC pointed out that the arrangement of allowing the public to enter counting stations to observe the counting of votes is to facilitate their monitoring of the election. Nonetheless, members of the public should comply with the house rules of the counting station, as well as abide by the ruling made by the PRO in accordance with the law. The EAC considers that the REO should determine the maximum capacity of the public area in a counting station in future elections with regard to the actual circumstances of the station. And the REO should also look into the staff and equipment for video recording the entire counting process in the counting zone to assist the law enforcement agencies with the necessary evidence in the future. And in terms of enhancing training, publicity, and education, the EAC feels that the REO should enhance the capability of polling staff in counting, dealing with problematic ballots, and maintaining order in the counting stations. Meanwhile, the REO should also educate and promote the functions of different counting stations and the counting procedures. If members of the public do not abide to the instructions, the relevant legal consequences and details are in the annex of the paper. We are happy to answer questions, with the floor now open for questions from members. 13 members are waiting to speak. First round, 3 minutes each, please.
So I'm going to read out the names. Madam Mak Mei Kun, Kok Ka Kei, Luk Chung Hong, Yang Ok Q, Wong Big Wan, Lam Chang Teng, Cheng Chong Tai, Ma Fong Guok, Li Hui King, Chu Hai Tik, Zhao Ho Ding, and Wang Ma Ho, and Leung Chi Chang. So 13. The speaker is speaking off mic, I'm sorry. So we were required to press the button before we could speak. I'm sorry if I caused any misunderstanding, so let's get on with it. Madam Mak Mei Kun, I have noted that in 13.111 of the report, it says that a lot of packaging works and transportation work has been done. And this is really in response to the incident that in 2016 a voters register has been lost. And so in response to that, the report says that a lot of things have been done to rectify that. And so I just want to know, what is your conclusion? This time, have you lost any voters register? Is it possible that 2 years down the road, you're going to tell us again that you have lost something? Are you saying that this time around you have already counted all the voters register and they're all in places? And the second point has to do with queuing. And just now it was mentioned that there was certain confusion on the day of voting, and also certain improvements should be made to the queuing arrangements. And there are calls to say that for people with special needs, there should be special queuing arrangements. But actually, on the voting day, actually the confusion was really quite great because the arrangements differ from one voting station to another. And some wheelchair-bound voters have been notified that they could actually get in the front of the line. But when they got to the front of the line, they were told to go back to the back of the line. And so they were really being really pushed around from the front of the line to the back of the line, and then vice versa. And actually, this item should be discussed in conjunction with the next item. But of course, there have been some objection. I think there should be very direct and clear guidelines governing the arrangements for these voters with special needs. And also about the arrangements at the counting stations. So I think you have already learned that there was a lot of confusion at the counting stations. And there were sometimes counting discrepancies. For instance, Lam Tin, J19 voting station. The one actually returned, the one who won the election actually was stuck there for hours upon hours. So now you learn that the counting stations as well as the queuing arrangements have been subject to a lot of confusion. And so what are you going to do next time around? And comes the next election, if such confusion and such a public pressure is to occur again, then what are you going to do? Are you going to submit to the public pressure? Now, concerning the Chengyi constituency and the loss of the voter register, the EAC actually has done a investigation report in July, and there have been a lot of recommendations coming out of that report, and so we have already taken steps in order to implement the recommendations. As for queuing, the report indeed sees that different voting stations have got different arrangements. As for physically handicapped and the relevant queuing arrangements, the EAC recommends that it should be fine-tuned and it should be modified. And so not only physically handicapped, but also elderly people who are weak, and also pregnant women, and so on and so forth. In due course today, we can discuss this further. As for vote counting, indeed, the report has given a lot of attention to it in order to address confusion at voting stations and try to get to the bottom of the causes and so on and so forth. And in the coming electoral election and the relevant guidelines, the AEC will recommend that certain improvements be made. And I will go into further details when we come to the next item. right? Mr. Kokake. So everything the government does now is trying to help the pro-establishment camps to win more votes. Now, the number of voter turnout actually is 100% more than last time. I think the government actually has been very, very negligent. If there have been more voting stations and if the process has been smooth, then people wouldn't have had to queue a whole day long at the voting stations to vote at the last time. And now the government is trying to blame all other irrelevant factors for the confusion. Now, of course, people with special needs, pregnant women, physically handicapped, there should be special arrangements. I have no objection to that. But this time, the government has been negligent. And I think the government is trying, or was, at the last election, trying to protect the votes for the pro-establishment camp. Now, for the March 11th election, for the Yu Chong-yim election, the government adopted a whole different set of arrangements. The government was being very, very partial and very, very unfair. And so are you telling us that if the pro-establishment camp has lost the last election, then you are going to think of new ways in order to help them to win the next one? So I hope that the Deputy Secretary can go back to your bureau and try to convince your whole bureau to make an apology to the entire community of Hong Kong because of the inadequacies and the very serious problems that came out of the last election. I cannot agree with Mr. Kwok. And actually, if you look at the voter turnout this time, it was really an historical high. And both the EAC and the statutory organization both felt that the election this time was very fair and just and very properly administered. However, how do we explain the long queues? The reason why there was long queue was because in the first 3 hours of voting, the voter turnout was very, very, very high. As a result, of course, there will be queues. And the AAC now has proposed improvement measures in order to smooth out the next election. So are you going to come up with an 100% increase in manpower in order to rectify the situation? Are you going to double manpower provision? This is a very clear question. Last year at the DC election, there were certain new features. First of all, we've got 21 new seats, and also all 68 seats were contested. All 68 constituencies were contested, and all 1,000 seats were contested. And so this year, are you going to make up for us? Of course, for manpower provision, we are going to increase it. Are you going to double it? Not necessarily doubling. To increase it to an adequate level. Now, for the March 11 election petition, why is it that it took you over 1 year to handle it? I think he has already answered you. It's because of insufficient manpower. For last year's DC election, we respect the outcome. The reason why there were queues, apart from very high voter turnout, another reason was that people actually try to queue up a second time and a third time, and so on and so forth. And of course, they've got their own ulterior motives. I think for queuing, one very big problem was that there were many, many cases, not one cases, but many, many cases. Certain candidates and their teams were really very seriously affected by very aggressive supporters of the pan-Democrats who actually swarmed the polling stations. As a result, certain candidates were not able to go into the polling stations to monitor the voting process. So I think this is something that should be rectified. I don't think you should allow the aggressive supporters to really swarm the polling station so that candidates couldn't go in and try to monitor the voting process. Another thing is it possible for us to videotape the entire vote counting process from different angles so that everybody feels at ease that the voting counting process was accurate, and also there is no foul play. And also at item Q concerning the tallying of total number of voters and actual votes that have been cast, there was a gap between the two. I think where do you draw the line is really a very important point. Now, of course, now you say that certain witness will be there in order to witness the crossing out of the names. But is it possible for you to do one thing more? After crossing out the lines of the voters that have voted, a text or a message will be sent out to make sure that that voter's name has been crossed out so that there is no double voting, and also there is no question that certain voters' names would be hijacked for a second round of voting. Now, concerning the dissemination of information, indeed, the report says that at the polling stations or at the vote stations, there should be improvements. And I'll go into further details. Indeed, the EAC is going to recommend that there be videotaping at the vote counting station, and also to smooth over the queuing arrangements, and also to smooth over traffic of voters. Now, is it possible for you to ensure that the candidates and their teams can be allowed to observe the vote counting process? At present, actually, or at the last election, space was already provided for. Unfortunately, it was not enough. The space was not enough. Now, is it possible for you to ensure that the candidates and their teams could definitely be guaranteed some space and also a chance to observe the entire vote counting process before the outcome of the vote is being announced? Indeed, we're going to look into that. As for crossing out the names, right now we have to strike a balance. Of course, we want the polling process to be confidential. And so at present, there is a board there so that the voter actually can vote in a situation of confidentiality. And also a ruler will be made in order to cross out the names of the voter. Indeed, we are now looking at ways in order to make sure that the voters can see personally that his name has been crossed out, but at the same time, he won't be able to see other voters' names being crossed out. Mr. Yeung? Now, many lawmakers are claiming that some voters go back to the end of the line and queue again and again and again. I just want to know whether this can be substantiated. Now, if you look at the voter turnout statistics, you can see the various categories there. Overall, the voter turnout is a historical high in terms of number of complaints, 45,000. And many of them have to do with election nearing activities and election advertisement and so on and so forth. Now, I ask a very specific question. Now, when there are lawmakers claiming that the people are queuing up again and again and again after they have voted, I just want to know whether this is substantiated. If so, how bad was the situation? How prevalent was it? Now, for name dropping in the process of voting or voting with a false identity, I think that's one of the major categories of complaints indeed. Now, as for complaints against people queuing up again and again and again, there have been 185 such cases of complaints.
Of the 158 complaints, 134 investigations were completed. And with the consent of the complainants, some cases were referred to the ICAC. For the remaining 128 complaints, we failed to obtain the consent of complainants, so we are unable to follow up. We are talking about 6 such cases to be being referred to the ICAC. With 3 million electors, this is not a very serious situation, right? So I do not think this warrants highlighting by some of the legislators. In 2019, the number of registered voters, well, I have a comparison between 2019 and 2015 for the 3 main elections. When you knew that the number of registered electors exceeded 4 million last year, or 9% higher than the previous election, in identifying polling station, the number of polling stations only went up by 6% compared with 2015. This was totally disproportionate. Did you try your best to identify more polling stations in order to ease the crowds and facilitate the queuing? It's always a difficult job to identify polling stations. More than half are schools, while the rest were various facilities. So where do the difficulties lie? Since the polling took place on a Sunday, we had to return the venue early the next day, and some schools had such concerns. But regardless, we would continue to identify more suitable venues. This has always been our policy. Deputy Secretary, last year, we saw that the number of candidates would be higher than the past, and the number of contested constituencies were also greater than the previous election. So we did our best to identify more polling stations and to recruit more staff. Without staff, more polling stations would be meaningless. Last year, the social incidents meant that we face great challenges in both. Like Mr. Leung said, some civil servants who had applied withdrew their applications, and certain schools and venues that could have been used at polling stations had a lot of concern about the social incidents at the time, and the REO had to do a lot of lobbying and reinforce our insurance policies. I could say that many venues were only confirmed at polling stations at the last minute with our best efforts. And in view of the social environment, we faced great challenges last year. Dr. Helena Wang. Chairman, I think the government's role is to maintain a fair and impartial election rather than hamper the intentions of people to vote. The queuing time for the electors was way too long, but our view was that there were too few polling stations. If you had to beg for people to provide venues at polling stations, since many of the schools are government or subvented schools, some of the schools were not open as polling stations, and electors had to walk a long way to vote. So even the government schools did not cooperate. I think all the schools are obliged to do so. They cannot say no. This is a matter of Hong Kong, and you should have a chat with the Secretary for Education. So the government should get it done by way of legislation. We must have more polling stations, or else in the coming electoral elections, everyone would suffer. Electors are complaining regardless of age. So you must take out actions and promise to introduce more polling stations. Of course, manpower is also important. We have 170 or 80,000 civil servants. So you should get prepared ahead of time. In this past election, there was an impression that the government was not impartial, and even civil servants do not offer the impression that they are politically neutral, and there was a lack of oversight at some polling stations. There were phantom ballots. It happened already. We would not accept any forgery. And in Kwai-Ching, the number of ballot papers issued was 8,029, but the number of ballot papers received were 8,089. It was impossible, save for a miracle. So that means some kind of forgery must have occurred. So that occurred at one of the polling stations. I don't know whether it agreed at other polling stations, but in any way, it was a scandal. So what measures would the government install to prevent any further forgeries in the future? As for the issue of using schools at polling stations, I would defer to the Deputy Secretary. Like I said, the EAC is an independent statutory body. In their report, they pointed out that the election completed in an open and honest manner. As for the issues identified, they were also covered in the report. If the allegations are substantiated, I urge everyone to report to the law enforcement agencies. We play by the rule of law, so it's important to think about the law. As for the ballot papers, as I understand, there were no ballot papers with unknown origin. I asked about the measures you have in place to prevent the phantom ballot papers. This is an issue mentioned in the report. Well, would the CEO answer the question? Thank you. In the 600-odd polling stations, there was only a single case in which the number of ballot papers received was higher than the number of ballot papers issued. We are unsure of the reason. We would not rule out illegal acts. So the case was referred to the law enforcement agency, so I would not speculate on the potential reason. Was it out of negligence, other human reasons, or illegal acts? Next, Mr. Lam Chia-Teng. Chairman, some elderly people, people with disability, and pregnant women, and the priority queuing arrangement for these people. On polling day, many people went to vote in the morning because many people were concerned that if there was any chaos on polling day, the government would terminate the polling. Even though the government stressed that the polling could continue the next day should that happen, but many people did not trust the government, and that's why they decided to vote in the morning. That's why there were long queues in the morning, and by afternoon, there weren't a lot of long queues at most constituencies. The REO also admitted that for people with health needs, they could be arranged to take a seat in the polling station, and they would be given a slot. So you are allowing these people to so-called jump the queue. So that would create a big issue. If there's a separate queue for these people, then people who plan to vote in the morning might have to wait even longer because certain people can jump the queue after they arrive. For people without special needs, the long would only get longer and longer, while the priority queue would move swiftly. So that would create a great doubt among the electors who are queuing up. This is certainly not conducive to the order at polling stations. So currently, for people with special needs, they can take a seat and wait for their turn. Why are you giving them priority? Would this lead to greater issues of management at the polling stations? I think Mr. Lam has moved on to the next agenda item, but I would offer a response nonetheless. There are two main aspects to the EAC's recommendations. One, to improve the queuing arrangements to better facilitate the various counters, and two, for people with special needs such as pregnant women, physically handicapped persons, and senior citizens, would they be allowed priority? So it is a question that could be discussed. So if we have a priority or special care queue, I think this is nothing new. This is simply to facilitate people who are less fit. I think this is just simply a caring arrangement. Mr. Lam said there is a context to it. Well, this arrangement can apply anytime, everywhere. Of course, our society needs care. There are priority seats on buses, but it doesn't mean that elderly electors can automatically join the head of the queue. Currently, we are allowing electors with special needs to take a seat. If you give them priority, then you will be creating a lot of conflict. So you should consider this very carefully. Inevitably, we would touch upon items, issues related to the next item. I would be lenient here, and a number of members are waiting to speak. So we would spend a relatively longer time on this item. Next, Dr. Chen Xiongtai. Thank you. First of all, we do not accept the explanation from the EAC or REO on the occurrence of phantom ballot papers at the Kwai Ching polling station, or the discrepancy of 60 ballot papers. You cannot say that only one polling station saw this scenario, and apparently it was an exception. So the occurrence of this case show that there were errors in the procedures, and as of now, you do not even know why there were 60 ballot papers, and you were referring this case to the law enforcement agencies. This is not the first time it happens. In the past years, you have lost some laptop computers and the particulars of more than 3 million electors. And for the Qingyi register, it was lost. In every case, you refer them to the law enforcement agencies, but nothing came of it. That happened every single time. You are eroding the confidence of the public in the elections. This is the third time already. There were 60 extra ballot papers. You referred the case to the LEA. So how could they follow up? Was it a case of theft? But there was nothing stolen. So if I'm a police officer, how am I going to deal with this case? What am I supposed to investigate? Is it misconduct in public office?
So can you let me know exactly what you are investigating into? So is the chief officer going to answer this? According to the legislation, after the election is over, we are going to seal off all ballot papers unless there is a court order or there is investigation by law enforcement agency, we do not have any right to reopen the sealed ballot boxes. So whether indeed there is a surplus of 60 extra ballot papers or whether there were other reasons, we cannot answer. At this point in time, we can only refer this case to law enforcement agency, and we do not rule out the possibility that indeed the ballot box could have been tampered with. Still, as I said, we need to defer it to law enforcement agency. Say I were the CID in charge or the Criminal Offense Investigation Unit. Exactly what am I investigating? So there were 60 ballot papers unaccounted for. And there have been 3 incidents, and 3 incidents have been referred to the police, and yet there have been no outcome at all. And so we don't even remember who the presiding officers in each case have been. So they have already answered that they don't know whether it's a foul play or whether it's a human error and so on and so forth, has to be deferred to law enforcement agency. And so it is very difficult for them to tell you exactly what the police is going to investigate. I don't think this is going to be along the line of terrorism, is it? Mr. Ma Fong Kwok? Regarding this report from the government, there are several areas which caused my disappointment. Indeed, there have been a large number of complaints. And before the election, there was a very high level of violence in the community. And I ran into the Secretary of Constitutional Affairs and I talked to him saying that because of social unrest, was it really fair to hold the election at that point in time? But if you look at the report now, the report has made no mention of the fact that there have been very unfavorable social circumstances before the election, and also whether certain candidates have been subject to unfair situation. And I myself actually have encountered very extraordinary situations when I was going there to vote. At around 8 a.m., I encounter people who claim that they were government officials and they were actually collaborating with polling station officers to manage the flow at the voting station. And so they gave people the impression that they were also government officials, but actually they weren't. And so that's what I encounter outside the polling station. And also, after I voted, I tried to approach the table a little bit in order to see and make sure that my name has been crossed out, but I was not allowed to. I was actually pushed back by 1 step. And so I had no way to find out whether my name indeed had been crossed out, and to make sure that no other person could make use of my name. And so this is completely different than the situation before, than the elections before, and I hope that the government can answer me on that. How come this was allowed to happen? And as for paragraph 19, the election process is to be computerized, and that's the way forward, and the REO should be tasked with the responsibility of looking further into this. Actually, this has been mentioned over a decade ago, and there have been calls saying that the election process should be computerized. Why is it that it is still in the research stage? You are now saying that you're going to study this even further. But what does it mean? Are you going to apply it in the coming electoral election? Are you going to computerize the coming electoral election? Last year, before the DC election, indeed, there was a lot of social unrest and there was a lot of violence in the community. And the EAC's report indeed has mentioned this. And let me read this out. In the opening paragraph, in the preface, it is mentioned that social order is being challenged, and so we have to rely on law enforcement agency in order to enforce the law on prevention of bribery in election and prevention of unfair election and so on and so forth. Now, if there has been unfair election, or if people have felt that there has been a very extensive scale of bribery in election, then they could always raise this with the authority. Now, why is it that the EAC report is silent on the unfavorable social circumstances? Is it that the government feels that this election was conducted very fairly and also against a very fair and proper background and it was completely honest? No, I don't think the report is silent on this. I think the report has made mention on this. Now, as for computerization, indeed, that is a way forward, and we've been taking steps to push this forward. We have already invited the relevant government officials to have a look at our electronic vote counting device, and so this is going to be taken further. Unfortunately, because of the social unrest last year, the tryout of the device has been postponed, and so it will be quite difficult for us to implement it at the coming electoral election, given how things are at the moment. As for electronic matching of names of voters against the register and also the crossing out of the names of the voters that have voted. Now, exactly what happened? Now, because it is a voter register right in front of the officials, and also the bottom line is that to not let the third person knows that a certain voter has already voted, and that's why there is a board segregating the voters from everyone else. And when we come to the next item, we will come up with specific arrangements in order to facilitate voters witnessing their names being crossed out after they voted, and also other people won't be able to see that. Now, as for people with dubious ID, cooperating with bona fide government officials managing the polling stations, I think you should give me more information, or give us more information and give us more background so that we can investigate into it. Actually, we have already made a complaint, but so far it has been to no avail. I think the EAC has to ensure that the election is fair and just and honest. And what exactly does that mean? It means that from the moment of registration and all the way to the announcement of voting result, the entire process has to be fair and just. But if you look at the last DC election, it was fraught with violence and aggressive behaviors. And during election and during electioneering period, many pro-government or pro-establishment candidates actually have been subject to physical violence and have been subject to a lot of very undue interference. So I'd like to ask EAC whether you still consider this to be fair and just. Now, Chapter 6 is about voting and also vote counting process, and Chapter 5 is about nomination and registration. Now, you have received so many complaints. Why is it that those complaints have not been mentioned in a report? Now, I just want you to answer me first whether you believe the last DC election was still fair and just. Now, when candidates were prevented from doing electioneering activities, when they were not allowed to put up even the posters without the posters being torn off, and also when they were being physically beaten up, do you still feel that when all of these incidents have occurred, you still consider the last election fair and just? Why is it that your report is silent on this? Now, why can't you let me know? Do you still consider the last DC election acceptable and also fair and just? Now, why don't you give me a straight answer first? All along, our position is that we have to say no to violence. Now, this is very clear, and last year we've been saying this and insisting on this repeatedly. And the report also says that we should really cherish Hong Kong's very fine election culture, and we ask all sides not to resort to violence. And we've been in very close liaison with law enforcement agency, in particular police, and we have done quite a bit of enforcement work. Now, as for the EAC's report, I don't think it is completely silent on this. If you look at page 69, paragraph 20.8, it says that after months of social unrest and also violence in the community, the election took place, and a lot of statistics have been given. I don't think you have answered me whether you consider this fair and just. Doesn't the EAC have the responsibility of ensuring that from the moment of nomination and registration all the way to the announcement of vote outcome, the entire process must be fair? And also whether your report really mentions this issue too little. Why is it that you haven't devoted even one chapter to describing what exactly transpired during the voting process? Is it that you consider this unimportant? So is it that as long as everybody is properly nominated and also registered, then you won't care whether candidates have been beaten up, and you only care about whether the votes have been counted and have been cast? I think the report at the very beginning has already pointed out that the election was held against a very unfavorable background. Now, do you think just one line is sufficient to describe the gravity of the situation? So I think from the very beginning, the EAC's report already described the unfavorable social situation. And if you believe that there should be more mention of it, I could indeed discuss with the EAC about this. But that is a fact, the unfavorable social circumstances, and they've been pointed out. And the mechanism is that the law confers upon us the authority to postpone a certain election. And last year, we had a crisis management committee looking at social unrest and made recommendations on the basis of that. And this year, we are going to watch even more closely social developments to see whether those developments would affect the propriety of the upcoming election. Chairman, I really cannot accept that this report fails to mention the unfairness of the last DC election. Now, if members still have not pressed button to indicate their wish to speak, please do so. Madam Lee Wai King, if you do not accept, you could always come up with a temporary motion. You are eating into other people's time. I've got several questions. I can see that the report says that there have been 56 complaints saying that people have assumed other people's ID to cast vote. And also there have been worries that if a voter approaches the ballot issuing table and has discovered that the voter's name actually has already been crossed out before he or she has voted, he or she would not know how to follow up on this. I'd like to know about the 56 complaints of assumption of other people's ID. How many of these actually are cases where the voters have approached the ballot issuing paper and have discovered that their names have already been crossed out even before they have cast the vote? And so how can their voting right be restored to them? A second question about the sequence in the voter register. Now, it seems that the sequence actually has affected the efficiency of voting, because at present the sequence is being laid out in accordance with ID numbers, and the voter register is accordingly divided into several parts. So the government is trying to review the situation and try to increase the efficiency. So are you saying that for elderly people, originally there were 2 voter register, and in future you're going to have 4? And third is a very simple suggestion. I agree that we should look after people with special needs, of those who are physically handicapped and weak, and also pregnant women. That it doesn't mean, however, that they should be given priority in voting. I think there are many other ways to look after their special needs. For instance, to give them shaded places, to give them seats, and also to give them drinks and tables and so on and so forth. Or you could broadcast the situation outside the polling stations on TV, so that these people with special needs would only come to the polling stations when there are no long queues, instead of simply giving them priority in voting, which I do not agree with. Okay, I'll go into the record to see whether I can give you more details. As for priority queuing, indeed, we are in the process of collecting views. For priority queuing, I have already explained what has been our consideration, and the bottom line is that we want to cherish Hong Kong's very fine culture of looking after people with special needs. Now, queuing is something we are all accustomed to, and so everybody is used to queuing. It's only that people with special needs sometimes are physically weak and they cannot stay in line for too long, and so the EAC has come up with a suggestion to see whether priority in the queue should be given to them. And so that is a solicitation of views attempt. Now, for the 56 complaints about repeated voting, what happened was that the 56 voters, when they approached the ballot issuing table, the officers on the spot already discovered that their names have been crossed out. So that is being counted as repeated voting. And of the 56 complaints, with the consent of the complainant, one of the cases has been referred to ICAC, and of the other 4 cases, investigation on them has been completed. And we are in the process of referring such cases to relevant authority, and another 5 cases are still subject to ongoing investigation. As for the sequencing of voter register, at present we use the preface alphabet for laying out the sequence. We have thought of other alternatives. For instance, the digit in the bracket could be one possibility. But our consideration is that all of a sudden we change it to the bracketed figure, it might cause even more confusion. And we are now looking at a certain flexibility in using the alphabets in laying out the sequence of the voters registered. So that we can have different tables handling different number of voters. And say we can leave more room for the presiding officer to make on-the-spot decision. Say if a certain table actually has got a shorter queue, then we can even out the numbers with the presiding officers making decision on the spot.
Ms. Eldon Chow, I'd like to follow up on the question asked by Ms. Sari Lee. It was a very simple question. Apparently, the report did not mention the black-clad violence, which had persisted for a very long time. Is the EAC ignoring this? I hope you can explain the situation. According to the updated guidelines, I hope you would answer some of our requests, that is to give priority to elderly voters. This is out of consideration of their physical conditions, and this is to prevent the fact that elderly people would lose their right to vote because they could not stand or queue up for a few hours. And I welcome this proposal, but this alone is not enough. I have a few recommendations. First of all, I hope you won't repeat your mistakes. At the past district council election, there were some appalling scenes. The polling staff or presiding officers either did not grasp your guidelines, or there could be other reasons when they administered the voting process. They made a lot of mistakes. Some physically handicapped people should have enjoyed priority in voting, but when they arrived at the polling stations, they were kicked out with crude language by polling staff, and elderly people were being yelled at. So I hope you would improve your training on polling staff and to check whether there was some improper conduct at the polling stations. As for the electronic distribution, balloting and counting of votes, apparently this could not be done this time. In terms of the distribution of ballot papers, voting and counting, we saw plenty of issues, and these could not be ignored by the government. When are you finally going to adopt electronic distribution, balloting, and counting? Why aren't you considering such option? Undersecretary, thank you for the question. In terms of staff training, it would certainly be reinforced. In terms of the electronic distribution of ballot papers, this is something we are studying. We must look at the details. The technology is reliable, but whether it is reliable and people would trust the system are also important. For example, some people might be worried that their voting intentions might be leaked, or whether anyone is playing tricks in the middle. So what if the machine or computer breaks down? What would happen? For instance, if the system is grounded, so how could you handle the interfacing between the physical register and the one in the computer system? We cannot say that this could be done in the coming election, but we are doing our best. There's no dedicated chapter in the report on violence, but in the prelude, it has been mentioned, or in the introduction, and it had been mentioned in 5 or 6 chapters as well. So it's not that we did not mention this issue. Mr. Jeremy Tam. Thank you. I'd like to ask about this blue booklet, which is the report on the 2019 District Council election. Members asked about the distribution of ballot papers. 13.45 says this about the queuing arrangements in polling stations. At each polling station, there are multiple ballot paper issuing desks. The number of desks would depend on the number of electors at a polling station. So what is the ratio? So how many electors would you have for each desk? In the 2019 DC election, there would be one issuing desk every 1,500 electors. So you have one issuing desk for every 1,500 electors. In the District Council election on 24th of November, did you achieve this ratio? At all polling stations, yes. So there was no issue of a lack of manpower, which in turn led to inadequate ballot paper issuing desks. Like you said, for every 1,500 electors, there would be one issuing desk. Let's assume that in a constituency there are 15,000 electors, there should be 10 desks. So this is something you managed to achieve on the 24th of November, right? Can you confirm that? Overall speaking, there would be a desk every 1,500 electors. Due to different sizes of the polling stations, there could be minor deviations. My question is very simple. Let's assume the turnout rate is again 70%. Even if you introduce priority queues, other people would have to wait longer because the ratio of 1,500 electors per desk remains unchanged. Are you going to adjust the ratio so that you could have more staff and to ease the queuing? If that's the case, you would no longer need a priority queue. If you are willing to adjust the ratio to one desk every 1,200 electors, of course, the size venue is another issue. If that is not possible, you can identify alternative sites because you don't have any issue with manpower. Thank you. In the 2019 District Council election, most issues occurred in the morning. In the first 3 hours, 720,000 electors turned out, which was 3 times the voter turnout of previous election. It's like making phone calls. If everyone makes calls at the same time, the network will be congested. In the coming election, we hope to achieve a ratio of 1,300 or 1,200 electors per desk. Venue permitting, if we are able to identify adequate polling stations, we hope to achieve a ratio of 1,200 to 1,300 electors per desk. Then you would no longer need a priority queue. The EAC simply wishes to consult the public while the report is published. We have no presumptions. We welcome any recommendations from the public. Mr. Leung Shichang. Thank you. The DC election on the 24th of November was full of violence. So it was conducted under this context. The voter turnout was extremely high. We also saw that violence had a big impact on the on many candidates. I went to many polling stations in Yuen Long and Tin Shui Wai. There were a lot of elderly voters who wanted to vote, but they couldn't. Some so-called young people, they repeatedly joined the queues after they voted. So some queues lasted 3 hours. Some elderly people gave up and went home. A couple with wheelchair told me that they could not wait anymore. They had to go home. The EAC indeed came up with some recommendations, but they stirred a lot of controversies in terms of the fairness of elections. Well, some people argued up that those who had difficulties queuing are not in favor of themselves, but allowing people with special needs to vote first, of course, this would attract different views. So this has to do with different factors. For example, the capacity of the polling stations and whether it can facilitate multiple queues and whether the venue is suitable. I know that you have identified a number of schools. So in most cases, this was fine. But what about rural areas? Are you going to introduce more polling stations to allow for these priority queues? So for those who oppose the idea, I want to say that everyone could face difficulties or experience difficulties. So it would be regrettable if they cannot vote. So in this case, fairness is not the only thing in the world. On polling day, I saw some public officers involved in the counting process. When they saw that their preferred candidates were returned, then they would cheer and yell. So I'm not just talking about specific public officers, but crowds, a lot of public officers. Undersecretary, so what is their attitude towards the elections? Are they biased towards their own preferred candidates. So this caused doubts that the entire election was not impartial. So this would create a crisis in confidence for the government. Please be concise in your reply. Thank you. So the officers must behave in a fair and impartial manner. So this is a basic requirement. If there are any contraventions, we are happy to follow up. So if there are specifics, we would follow up. As for the queuing arrangements, these have been discussed time and again. So this is about equal chances, and this is not the same as first come, first served. We would consider electors' abilities. So people who are unfit, they are unfit. If their chances to vote are jeopardized due to that, then that would be unfair. As to whether there are better practices or approaches, we welcome suggestions. Mrs. Regina Yip. Chairman, I have two questions. Mr. Raymond Wang and Mr. Andy Chan said they had to consult the public on the queuing arrangements. These are not new policies. These are just operational deployments. Why do you have to consult the public on that? Are you trying to delay things? Well, look at the counters at Ocean Park or Disneyland or even Immigration Department. If there are crowds, there would be flexible deployments. This is only natural. You are supposed to be smart. Why are you consulting the public over everything? These are decisions you must make for yourselves. Well, I am really angry about this. You are dodging your responsibility. For electors who are aged 65 or 70, then you can adopt flexible queuing arrangements on site. So that should be straightforward enough. So stop telling me that you are going to consult the public. By the election in September, you must have flexible queuing arrangements. As for people passing up as other electors, you said you received 56 such complaints. There were no such cases in the past. To curb these cases, then there is a very simple method. That is to use fingerprints. The Hong Kong identity card carries fingerprint information. It's being adopted by the police already, and they can tell very immediately the identity of the electors. You can procure such equipment, so you can check the fingerprints of electors. Then there would not be any controversies. Why can't you even get this done?
Now, why is it that you try to complicate everything and then simply end up doing nothing? Now, thank you, Madam Yip, for her questions. Now, as for queuing, every time there is an election for Electoral, EAC will come up with a set of guidelines, and every time the set of guidelines is being put to public for consultation, and queuing arrangement is really part of that consultation, and so it's not being singled out as an issue of a solitary consultation. I think you are being very, very inflexible and stale here. We are not asking you to change the legislation. We are asking you simply to consider priority queuing. So this is a very simple issue. Why is it that you need to put this out as part of the consultation? I heard Madam Yip, indeed, queuing is a very straightforward issue. Now, is it that there are other ways to come to the same result and same outcome? I think it is for the community to give views. Well, this is a very straightforward issue. You should consult the community. Now, as for electronic means, indeed, we've got our own technology experts to give us advice. Of course, We are not talking about extremely high tech here, and of course there are technological solutions, but still it would warrant a legislative amendment. And thirdly, I'm sorry, I'm not asking you to go to high-end electronic technology. I'm asking you not to use a ruler to cross out the names. I'm simply asking you to make use of an electronic fingerprint scanning means. Still, you need to amend the legislation in order to enshrine that. Indeed, the legislation sets very clearly that a ruler is being used and crossing out the names is a method. But can you be a little bit less inflexible? Now, when you were absent from this chamber earlier on, I put out a very practical issue. Now, if the system stops or if the system is down, then how can we transfer from the electronic device to handwriting device? Now, please don't try to dodge the issue. Let's not waste the time. Okay, I'm going to give the floor up for other speakers. Now, regarding this EC report, I would like to ask whether there is going to be any more vote rigging this year or vote planting. Can you let me know exactly what your concerns are? Of course, vote planting is something that is illegal, and of course, it is something that is not acceptable to us. Now, of course, the election has to be fair and just. But in the past, there have been elections that have shown that there was vote planting, and even Guangdong NPC members could actually assume a fake ID and plant votes. My upcoming question is, why is it that your system is still not perfect, and how can you fine-tune it? And also for the 2019 DC election, it has been completed. I'd like to know whether there have been any vote planting cases. Now, it all depends on whether you've got any evidence for such cases. If there is evidence, then of course we'll follow up on it. So you have no figures. Now, if you believe that you have questions and also comments about our mechanism, then we welcome them. Now, I think examples have been given in Kwai Fong. There have been 60 phantom votes, and you refer it to law enforcement agency. And so that's one situation. I just want you to let us know whether you have any kind of a impression or any kind of a feel as to whether the situation actually exists. Now, if the answer is yes, then how are you going to eliminate that? And if no, then of course it is a very, very clean election. I think this is a straightforward question. Let me let you know the mechanism. Don't tell me about the mechanism, but of course I have to tell you our mechanism because we're talking about a system here. Now, how can we prevent vote planting? All we can do is that, all we do is that we will check the voters' names against the register address and so on and so forth. If there is no match, then of course we would cross out and take out the voter's name. And if there are complaints, then of course we'll follow up on them, and if necessary, refer it to law enforcement agency. So the simple question is, do you believe that for the last DC election, the situation has been better or worse, or whether you have caught any people that have been guilty of vote planting? In 2019, we have received complaints 860 cases of complaints against vote planting involving 2059 voters. An investigation has been carried out, and around 1,800 of such cases have shown to be of no impropriety. And other cases have to do with a wrong input of residential addresses or failure to update addresses after the voter has moved houses, and also misinput of information such as third floor, fourth floor, and so on and so forth. And 56 cases are still being investigated by the police. Now, because you have such concrete figures, you should have told us that there have been 0 vote planting cases. Now, this is a fact. Now, you seem to give the impression that such cases are prevalent. Actually, only 2% of the cases are found to be substantiated. So why don't you simply tell me that there have been no vote planting cases? No, so we are simply telling you the statistics. I think that he has answered your question. Mr. Chen, just now Mr. Kwong asked whether this election was fair. I think everybody knows that the 2019 District Council election was anything but fair. Just now, Madam Wong has been very honest, and I usually do not agree with her, but today I do. Maybe she is in good shape. Now, concerning the Kwai Fong polling station at Lam Kuan Yin Primary School, and people see that there is a discrepancy of 60 votes that have been unaccounted for between votes or ballot papers that have been issued and the number of actual votes being cast. Now, if in any other time or in any other situation there should have been a re-election, and yet on that occasion it was declared a fair and proper election, and the complaint was only referred to law enforcement agency, and by the time the investigation yields any result, it would have been way too late to do anything. And so I think the last election was very, very disappointing. And if you want to give the community the confidence that the government really treats such complaints very seriously, then the government should have declared a mis-election, declare the election not valid. We are talking about 60 votes unaccounted for, but we don't know exactly how many votes have been tampered with. It could be 600, even 6,000. It could only be the tip of the iceberg. And I hope that the government can answer me this. Are you going to declare the election out of this polling station invalid, or are you going to go for a judicial review? And before the election, there was very heated discussion concerning whether certain people would be DQ'd. And also, there were candidates that have been very clearly involved in Hong Kong independence campaign. There were pictures and there were lots and lots of information on the internet to show that there is no question that they have been supportive of the Hong Kong independence campaign. And yet they have not been disqualified. Now, why is it that the legislation enshrining this disqualification of such candidates has not been enforced? Why is it that government resources actually have been used and deployed in order to support such candidates that should have been DQ'd? Now, concerning the problematic polling station, as the REO has pointed out, this has been deferred to the police for investigation. Let me give you some information concerning the 2 candidates in question. They already are aware of the situation, and as far as we know, they have not resorted to any judicial means in order to resolve it. Now, why is it that you leave it up to the candidates? Why can't the government take it up? And also, the difference in number of votes actually is in the range of over 1,000 instead of just several dozens. And the coming up point is outside of the scope of the report. This is about qualification to stand for the election, and this is very clear. And the candidate must be loyal to the SAR government and must swear allegiance to the SAR government and must uphold the basic law. And this is very, very clear. And also, all candidates are asked to make such a declaration to that effect. And this has been done. However, if you believe that there is certain clarity about any particular situation, please follow up on this together with us after the meeting.
Dr. Priscilla LEUNG, Chairman, at the DC polling day on the 24th of November from nomination period to polling day, the entire process was unfair and partial. It was clear for all to see. The election took place in the context of violence. Some of our supporters did not dare go to vote. My office and the candidate of our joint office was subject to 3 flare bombs or petrol bombs, and some of their supporters did not dare vote for them. So apart from the polling day itself, well, in the coming electoral election in September, you must ensure that 1 month before the nomination period, if the black-clad violence continues, you must consider whether the polling or election will proceed as usual. That must be a promise to make. As for the priority queue, I do not accept the fact that certain people would be against the idea. Well, there are priority seats on MTR trains and concessionary fees for elderly citizens. In their eyes, all these would be unfair. So these are people who would vote nonetheless. You are just providing convenience. Of course, what about voters without the resources? They would have to wait. Well, everyone would get old. Well, I had to drive to reach the polling station in my constituency. So the first time I went, I could not vote. I had to go back again 6 hours later. But what about elderly citizens? Could they go to the polling station again and again? I agree we should have more polling stations. The government has the money, so you should recruit more people. By the time the elderly voters arrived, their names were already crossed out, and an elderly elector saw a young man voting with the Hong Kong identity card of an elderly citizen. So for all these complaints, you must disclose the investigation results. When the counting process began, since there were too many black-clad people at the counting station, well, the candidate won by 30 votes. But one of the candidates told me that all his or her volunteers left already, so the candidate did not dare staying because he was surrounded by people clad in black. So I do agree that in the future we cannot allow for mass crowds at the counting stations. I sent in a lot of complaints without reply. The REO did not address our queries with the exception of the priority queue. Secretary, please be brief. We will cover this at the next item. At the counting stations, we recommend a series of measures to better maintain order. In terms of the queuing arrangements, before Dr. Leung came in, we had a lengthy discussion. The stance is that this is a basic courtesy in any caring society. For pregnant women and elderly people, it's about their physical fitness. If they could not vote due to a lack of fitness, then it would not be fair. In terms of violence, like I said, it's not ideal, it's not acceptable for the government, and we urge people to cut ties with violence. We will monitor the situation even more closely this year, and we are empowered to postpone the elections under certain circumstances. So I hope we would cherish our sensible election culture. So this year we would pay even closer attention to that. Ms. Tanya Chen, she's not here. Since time is limited, I would not allow for a second round. So that's all for agenda item number 3. I received 3 motions moved without notice, and hopefully I can deal with them at the end. We will now proceed to the 4th item, the proposed guidelines on election-related activities for the electoral election. Thank you. And under the Electoral Affairs Commission Ordinance, the AC may issue guidelines related to the conduct or supervision of the election. And we would update and publish the guidelines before electoral general election for adoption in the coming general election and any by-elections to be held thereafter. Last week, the EAC published the updated guidelines, and the public will be consulted for 30 days till the 7th of April. And in the meantime, the public can offer views on the proposed guidelines. In terms of the legislative updates, they cover voter registration, the provision of principal residential address, and only the address instead of principal residential address of each candidate will be published in the Gazette notice. And in terms of the ECICO, in relation to arrangements for lodging election returns by candidates and the exemption from criminal liability for a third party other than a candidate and his or her election expense agents who publishes an election advertisement on the internet, and the only election expenses thus occurred are merely electricity and or internet access charges. In terms of free postage, the size, there are new requirements on the dimensions of the free postage. And in terms of election expenses, apart from the arrangements for submitting the election returns, the limits on the maximum amounts of election expenses which can be incurred by candidates will be increased. And in terms of the safeguards on personal data, candidates are reminded to deal with personal data of electors according to guidelines of the PCPD, including the transfer of information. And candidates should also deal with the particulars of their supporters under the ordinance, and suggestions made with regards to the experience from the past election, including the polling station queuing arrangements, polling procedures, monitoring order at the counting stations. We would study the maximum capacity and explore video recording the counting process, since the proposed guidelines were published last week. Some people had misunderstanding towards Chapter 16 of the guidelines, and I'd like to make a clarification. And the ECICO set a limit on the election expenses, and election returns must be lodged to list all expenditure and donations to ensure that no candidate would exceed the expense cap. That way, every candidate can compete on a level playing field. If a candidate doesn't lodge election returns or declare all election expenditure, or if the expenses exceed the cap, then it would be illegal. So such arrangements have been in place since the year 2000. According to the ordinance, an election expense is defined as any expense or incurred by candidates or their agents to promote or prejudice the election of any candidate, and there was no time limit. And a candidate is defined as a person nominated as candidate in any election or on a candidate list, or anyone who announced that they had the intention to run. Since the election campaign might last a very long time and the starting time point might not be very clear, so people who intend to run, well, apart from people who submitted the nomination forms already, so people who announced that they had the intention to run at any point in time would be a candidate. As to what constitutes intention to run, so it would depend on the objective circumstances and evidence in order to determine whether a person is intending to run, instead of just the descriptions given or claims given by a candidate, including the intention to run, the relevant acts and whether they constitute part of the election campaign, and whether that person has made public his or her intention to run. As to whether these expenses would constitute election expenses, the CFA in a 2012 case, they set objective standards on what constitute election expenses, including whether expenses are incurred by a particular candidate and whether the work is part of the campaign, whether a person is a candidate, and whether the relevant expenses are election expenses must be based on facts and prevailing legislation. Past court judgments involved legal judgments. Anyone in doubt should consult legal advice or make inquiries to the ICAC. The EAC has no power to deal with legal issues. The EAC would only refer complaints to the ICAC for investigation. If there's any contention, the court would make the final judgment. The EAC reminds that all interested parties pay attention to all the legal requirements in order to not break the laws inadvertently. Anyone who feels that the laws must be amended must deal with the issue through a legislative means, and this is out of the ambit of the EAC. The EAC will consider all the views received in consultation period and finalize the guidelines, which would be issued around mid-June. Thank you. We welcome questions. Members waiting to speak. Anyone else? Even if I extend the meeting by 15 minutes, 9 members are waiting to speak. Anyone else? If not, I would draw the line here. Three minutes each, please. First, are we going to deal with those motions at the next meeting? All right. Dr. Sheng Tai. Thank you. In the DC election last year, the turnout rate was the highest ever. It exceeded 70%. And compared with the 47% turnout in 2015, it represented a rise of almost 50%. So based on this rise, in the coming electoral election, the total turnout will certainly be higher than 2016. So in terms of the manpower deployment of the REO, are there corresponding manpower considerations, or would it be like the past DC election? You would just do a very casual job and try to deploy staff on the fly. I hope the government would tell me what your expected growth in turnout will be. The REO is considering different measures to offer priority to pregnant women, elderly people, and PWDs. So these involve extra administrative work. Since we knew that the turnout will take a leap. Will the extra work exacerbate our current problems? For example, in terms of the queuing arrangements and order at the counting stations. At the past DC election, we saw they were chaotic, but I do not think the administrative arrangements would help facilitate the fairness of the election. In November last year, when Mr. Berbers Fong addressed the media, he said he would not allow the elderly to enjoy priority voting. He said no one would enjoy priority. But why half a year on, the government is proposing priority for elderly citizens? 3 minutes, please.
Indeed, we are going to extensively increase manpower in order to deal with all additional workload. I defer details to my colleague, and the REO is going to supplement. Of course, last year, all seats were contested, and also the number of voters turning out increased very substantially. And so we anticipate that this time around at the upcoming electoral election, the voter turnout will also be much higher, and the number of polling stations will be increased from 495 to over 600. And we also anticipate that voters have turned out for the DC election will also turn out for electoral election, and so we are going to increase resources. Madam Mo, you say that if someone has already participated in intra-party preliminary election, then you would have to look at a very concrete evidence because if someone is already declare his intention to run for election, then you have to look at concrete evidence before you would decide whether or not to disqualify him. I think this is simply very, very confusing. I think you are opening this up to free interpretation. Now, you say objective evidence, circumstantial evidence, and so on and so forth, and you say that, don't worry, the court will make a ruling. But I don't think the court has any time for it because you have arrested over 10,000 people. And I don't think the court will have any spare time for this. And so why is it that all of a sudden you are trying to create this confusing situation? It seems that you are trying to make things difficult. You are trying to require people to make declaration, and if there is a preliminary election, you are going to factor that into consideration. Why is it that all of a sudden you need to do that? What exactly are you trying to do? Answer me. I think he is waiting for you to complete your question. So are you stunned? Are you too shocked to give me an answer? Thank you, Madam Mo. I know you are very, very bilingual. Of course you understand. The legislative definition all along has always been the same. From the moment that a voter has made known his intention to run for election, then the authority will look at the relevant evidence to see whether there is any ground for doing any enforcement. And the bottom line is that everything should be made clear and laid out in the open so that nobody would contravene the law inadvertently. And so all along that has been the legislative spirit. Now, if nothing has changed, why is it that you are doing something so superfluous? I've never heard that as long as you have participated in preliminary election, then you might be considered having a chance to becoming a candidate. Why is it that you have added that in? In the 2018 electoral by-election, there were many, many candidates. And they might have participated in a campaign to announce their intention to run for election, but later on they withdrew. And so even these candidates that have submitted their election accounts and election expenses account, and so on and so forth. The EAC believes that we have the responsibility of reminding people who are interested in running of their legislative requirements that they have to fulfill. Mr. Chen. Now, it seems that a lot of focuses of discussion is on whether elderly people should be given priority. And Mr. Fung says that no one should have priority. And when someone has entered the polling station, then he'll have to get into a line. And no one should be allowed to jump the line. And it will be done in accordance with the alphabetical order on the voter register. But it seems that after the election, people's expectations have not been fulfilled. And so how much waiting is a particular voter being subject to depends on the situation on the polling station. Actually, flexibility should have been introduced at the polling station. Now, if you see that at the table handling alphabet A, where the queue was very, very long, then you could have deployed another table to take over alphabet A. So it could have been done very, very easily, evening out the number that each table has handled. Today, I want to talk about a more practical suggestion. Now, if there are certain issues that you cannot make a decision on, of course, you can consult the public. But there are other serious issues that you have to consider. Say, now the COVID-19 outbreak is still ongoing. And if the number of infections continue to increase, then what are you going to do? I know that you have the authority to postpone it, but according to the law, you cannot postpone it for too long. Now, you can only postpone it for, say, 10 days or so. Now, if the outbreak continues, then what are you going to do? I think this is a very serious issue. So that we would know where we stand, we would know what we do. And if the election cannot take place because of the virus outbreak, then there could be a legislative vacuum. There could be a political and constitutional vacuum. And even if you cannot give me a direct answer to me today, you have to consider all of these issues. Now, also people who are under quarantine, can they vote? Those who are at the quarantine centers, can they vote? For those who are on voluntary quarantine at their homes, can they vote? Now, all of these issues you have to think about, even if you don't have an answer right now. And also, are you going to provide face masks for people who are going into the polling station? Do they have to have their temperatures taken? If they have a temperature, are they still allowed to vote? All of these are key issues that would influence the handling of an election in a time of viral outbreak. I'd like to know whether the government has considered this. Now, concerning the virus outbreak, of course, we are keeping a very close watch over it. As for election preparation, as you have seen today, is still going on. We have to make preparations on all fronts, and let's hope that the virus situation is not too bad and the election can take place. But still, we have to look at all eventualities and look at all scenarios. And I thank Mr. Chen for pointing us to very practical issues that we need to pay attention to. I'd like to know whether you have not considered it at this point in time at all. Convener, please go on. Chairman, I'm also concerned about the definition for candidates, because it would affect people who are interested in running and those who have actually registered for running. Of course, it doesn't only affect the Democrat camps, but all other candidates. I think the proposed amendment actually would put a lot of doubt in the minds of those who are interested in running. For instance, for the party headed by Madam Regina Ip, they've got a very large field of candidates, and Mr. Lee Chi-king versus Yung Hoi-ran. Now, is that already a declaration of intention to run? It doesn't only affect Regina Ip's party, but also the DAB as well as the Democratic Party because we have our own intra-party preliminary election. Also, I hope that you can make this clear. What situations will be caught by your amended definition for candidates? Because once someone is defined as candidate, then election expenses will start counting, and that could result in exceedance of the limit, and that could result in disqualification. And Mr. Zhang Guoquan is a DBAAB. I don't know whether his seat will be contested, and he also faces the same question. And if you don't make it clear, and if you only leave it to the court, then after the election, if the court rules unfavorably against me, then I would be put at a very grave disadvantage. You are the governing body. How is a law going to be implemented and to be enforced? You have to make it very, very clear. You shouldn't do it the way government did with the face mask legislation, because the government leaves everything to the court, and that's very, very irresponsible. I don't think you should be like that. I think I've already responded to that. The legislative requirement is very clear. The definition for candidacy is already given very clearly in the law. And to put it succinctly, open announcement of the intention to run. Okay, what about political parties' internal preliminary election? Is that counted as announcement of intention to run? Now, Madam Yung Ho-yan is going to go up against Lee Chi-king. Is that considered an announcement of the intention to run? Now, let's listen very carefully. A public announcement that he is interested in running. Now, if you're talking about internal parties' preliminary election, now if someone has participated in it, then it is very difficult for that someone to say that actually he's not interested in the electoral election proper. Now, so that takes care of the interest in running election part. But so there is still the public announcement part that has to be satisfied. In that case, Regina Yip has to be very careful with her party. But your interpretation of the provision is already changed. I think what you see is what I see. I want to follow up on Lam Cheuk Ting's point. In the past, or all along, whether it's preliminary election within a political party or an open announcement of intention but subsequent withdrawal, and even if these candidates also declare the election expenses, then this shouldn't be a problem. Why is it that you are now adding additional stipulations? They are open to interpretation. Now, in the past, there have been by-elections where someone actually has taken out a whole floor advertisements just outside of Crossover Tunnel. I think that is stealing a jump on the election. But can your extra stipulations, additional stipulations, take care of such attempt to steal a jump on the election?
I'm no legal expert, but I simply want to state that the stating the intention to run does not change the principles or enforcement principles. But having said that, each case or scenario is different. This is the problem. You fail to tackle the real problems. Some people can take out massive advertisements. That is a massive advertisement outside a funeral home. You are saying that anyone who states their intention to run might fall into this legal trap, but this is not the issue. Well, this is what Mr. Yung said. Unless you tell us that there were serious problems in the past, there were people who tried to dodge legal requirements, but that wasn't the case. So what is the intent of the government? What are you trying to achieve? You are letting go of the big culprits, but you are trying to catch the small players. So what are you trying to achieve? The EAC proposes certain guidelines and they want to consult the public. Well, the law is here and the enforcement principles are always here. So can the Undersecretary give us a hand? Did a lot of people inadvertently break the laws and now you are preventing that? Is that the case? I think it is simply a reminder. I would see if the REO has any figures to share. In the 2018 by-election, some candidates announced their intention to run and subsequently quit. We could not distinguish between proactively lodging returns and people lodging returns upon our reminders. So that was the case in 2018. The EAC's intention is to remind everyone of the legal requirements and definitions. I hope people would not inadvertently break the law, so this is a kind reminder. Mr. Kenneth Lau. Chairman, the EAC proposes that for the coming electoral polling day for voters with special needs, such as pregnant women, those aged 70 or above, or those who are physically immobile can enjoy priority. I support the proposal. On behalf of Heung Yee-Kuk, the DC elections saw a record turnout and there were long queues at many polling stations. I saw that many elderly voters had to wait hours before they could vote. If we are able to provide special arrangements or support or assistance for these electors, that would only be beneficial. But how would it actually operate? Would pregnant women, PWDs, and elderly citizens enjoy or go on a different line? So for certain people, for example, women who are just pregnant, you might not be able to tell them how are you going to deal with them. I hope the government can come up with proper arrangements to prevent any arguments. The EAC are still taking in views from the public. However, if the public feels that there is a need to provide special queuing arrangements or variety queuing for pregnant women and elderly citizens, this is something we would consider. Operating a separate counter or table would be difficult, but some possible solutions might be to allow them to enter the polling stations, and when their turn is when it is their turn, they can vote. An alternative is that by the time an elector reaches a table, if the table is empty, then they can collect the ballot paper. The EAC remains open on the actual execution. What about women who are just pregnant? Hopefully they can produce a doctor's proof or medical certificate. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether a woman is pregnant or she simply has a round body. So it's better to produce a medical certificate. Ms. Dari Lee. I'd like to ask about the latest arrangements for people who intend to run. Many newspapers would interpret the work of different parties in their own way. well, for example, they are saying that our party will run primary elections. So would you rely on newspaper reports? Some of our plans are internal, so how would you distinguish the issue? You said there has never been any change. And secondly, you are saying that primary elections might be seen as an announcement to run. But how would you interpret internal primaries? On the long run, this would affect the nurturing and selection of talent for different political parties. But the work of the EAC is to promote fair and impartial elections and to facilitate the healthy development of parties. You should not come up with new restrictions or rules which would hamper the party's developments. And I'd like to follow up on what I just said. In the coming electoral election, if violence arises again, what will be the role of the EAC? Will you simply ask us to call the police again without you doing anything? You did not even investigate. Do you find such role appropriate? Are you going to tolerate violence? Would the EOC just ask people to resort to the LEAs? Undersecretary, thank you. As for the long-term development of political parties, we acknowledge such view. We will convey these views to the EAC. And whether the development of parties would indeed be affected. So for internal work that do not amount to primaries or primary elections, they would not constitute running for an election. As for the issue of violence, since last year, we have been saying that we would not tolerate violence and we urge everyone to cut ties with violence. For criminal matters, they would be deferred to the law enforcement agencies. The EAC is not an enforcement agency. As a matter of fact, its job to refer complaints to the LEAs. In the coming year, the legislation, like I said, the legislation is in place. So if certain conditions are met, the statutory powers are there to postpone the elections if necessary. That's why I hope the society would cherish our sensible election culture. Simply urging the public is not enough. For if future elections still take place in the context of violence, what would be the stance of the EAC? You never talked about this in your report. Last year, the EAC's Crisis Management Committee provided such information and explained the powers of the EAC. If there are riots, open acts of violence, and incidents that jeopardize public safety, there are clear legal provisions allowing for the authorities to consider postponing the election. This is very clear. 3 members are waiting to speak. First of all, do members agree with a further extension of the meeting till all the questions are completed? All right, Mr. Adishu. Thank you. I'd like to explore the issue of candidates. the so-called internal exercise of the DAB, they are choosing the so-called stars, future stars of the DAB. According to some media reports, they quoted from Holden Chow, a fellow legislator, and Holden Chow proved that, he confirmed that he will take part in the primary election, and he said that through the election he could report his work in the last few years. I think your answer could not alleviate the doubts of Starry Lee, even if they call it the future stars of the DAB. But everyone would know from the circumstances that it means a primary election, and even those who take part admitted that they are taking part in a primary election. So I have a question about the principle. Undersecretary, you said there are no changes to the laws, and the new text is simply a reminder. So can I say that all the acts from the 2016 electoral election, so long as it wasn't subject to challenge in 2016, it should not be subject to challenge in 2020? Is that the right call, Undersecretary? Thank you. So the gist is that a person who openly announces the intention to run. So there could be different scenarios. For example, media reports. I will get to your question soon. In 2016, many people claim that they would proactively consider to run. It depends on whether he or she would proceed to electioneering. So a simple claim that a person is proactively seeking to run would not amount to candidature. Many people intend to run, so that was not the key. The key is whether such intention has been published. He didn't answer my question. So for acts committed in 2016, if they are repeated in 2020, are we going to inadvertently fall into the trap? So if it wasn't illegal in 2016, it would not be illegal this year. All right, time's up. Mrs. Regina Yip. Chairman. The CMAB are proposing amendments, and you are reminding us of the definition of candidates, and you said this is nothing new. So why are you calling our attention to that? What is your motivation? So are you trying to pick mistakes or prosecute us? You are asking us to bear the liability, but you said the judgments lie with the court. So if this is nothing new, why are you reminding us? Because you are creating anxiety out of us. I must condemn you. You know, I seldom condemn the government. Every party would host primary elections. So if some people complain that they are actually signaling their intention to run, so can you? So for young party members who wish to run, will they be sued? Can you guarantee that they will not be sued? Thank you. You asked about the intention. Well, like I said, this is just a reminder. Why are you suddenly issuing the reminders? Are you looking to sue people? Well, if the reminders lead to concerns, and we would look at it from a case-by-case basis. We would convey the views collected to the EAC. So there remains a lot of gray areas. Of course, according to lawyers, every case would be a mixture of law and facts. But we are at risk of receiving a lot of complaints or inadvertently break the laws. We acknowledge your concern. We will convey such to the EAC. What about the priority queuing arrangements? Why are you catering for those age 70 or above? Why don't you use the threshold of 65 years old? Well, that is just an example for illustration purposes. Those age 70 or above make up more than 10% of all electors. If we change the threshold to 65, then the percentage would go up. So if the public feels that the threshold could be lowered, we are happy to listen.
Of course, our biggest concern is definition for candidates. And so when would someone starting to be counted as a candidate? And just now it was said that there were no provisions or no new stipulations. But if you look at the consultative document, actually we could feel that there have been changes. So you need to make us clear. Of course, different parties have got different ways of doing things, and some of them will have their own internal party primaries. And for the Democratic Party, every term we have our own internal party primaries. And all along, we have never considered someone that has participated in primary is an earnest declaration of intention to run for election, and election expenses will start counting. And so can you let us know categorically that participation in primaries would not result in election expenses started counting? I think the law is very clear on this. Intention to run for election, I think that is quite straightforward. If someone participates in primary election, that is usually because that someone is interested in participating in the upcoming electoral election. As for public announcement, now that is really a provision that could govern a whole range of public announcement. So how exactly are you going to define public announcement? Of course, if someone participates in the primary, he has the interest of participating in electoral election. But what if someone is being asked by media that he is going to go up against another potential electoral candidate? Now, is that considered an open declaration of intention to run for election? Okay, I heard you loud and clear. Say if I myself participate in a primary, and if I announce that I participate in a primary, then of course there is no dispute. Now, what about if someone says that I am participating in a primary, not out of my own mouth, but out of someone's mouth, and it is passed along to another person? Would that be counted as an open declaration of intention to run? Now, this is something that we definitely will consider how best to define this particular or interpret this particular definition. Now, about priority queuing for elderly people. Actually, all along, the polling stations have laid out the voter sequence by alphabets, and that actually already takes care of the differentiation in age bracket and the streaming of people according to ages. And why is it that not enough? Why is it that you have to create a special priority lane for elderly people? Now, of course, Madam Wong's description is one way. Now, say if there are insufficient counters for elderly people, of course we could open up more counters, and this is something we can consider. Another idea is to convenience elderly people to vote, or even to give them priority to vote. Now, if you are only talking about conveniencing them, of course, you could put down chairs and provide seating for them to sit while they wait for voting. Now, give them priority, of course, is a different matter, so that they can jump ahead of the queue. Of course, we are having an open mind on this, and we welcome discussion further on these issues. Now, we've got 4 motions. They will be for next time. And next time we'll only cast votes on the 4 motions, and we'll not further discuss today's 2 issues. Okay, meeting's adjourned.